Chicago. June 6, 1931. 2 a.m., gangster Frank McErlane, called the deadliest man in the Windy City, stands in the middle of the street during a downpour. As he is pelted by raindrops, he fires his automatic shotgun into the darkness, yelling at the enemies that are there to kill him. Enemies only he can see. Witnesses see no one else. He fires shot after shot while damning his imaginary foes out loud. His one shotgun spent, he drops it and grabs another and puts it into action. He also has a .45 tucked in his pants if needed. Responding to calls from neighbors, police arrive and McErlane stops shooting. Hopelessly drunk, he staggers about and babbles incoherently about being on the spot and successfully chasing his enemies away. They bring him to the station. He agrees that the cell will be a safe place for him and immediately falls asleep. After 20 years in the Chicago underworld, Frank McErlane's paranoia, itchy trigger finger and alcoholism are catching up with him. His life is a series of sadistic, whiskey-fueled crimes. A true psychopath, his reputation as a kill-crazy gunman was cemented in the Chicago beer wars of 1923. He is credited with being both the inventor of the one-way ride, probably erroneously, and of being the first gangster to use a Thompson machine gun. It is no surprise that McErlane ended up a gangster. He started out as one. Born in 1894, he went to work as a schlammer while still a teenager for the Chicago Newspaper Publishers Association during a lockout in 1912, in which 3 Union men were killed and others bludgeoned and stabbed. Around the same time, he was involved in a car theft ring. He was arrested for stealing an auto in 1911 and served a few months in the House of Corrections. He served a number of months the following year as well after another arrest. Since he was released early, each time it was suggested that he had some friends in high places due to the fact that his father had been a saloon keeper. Back on the streets, he moved up to armed robbery. He was rounded up with the gang in early 1913 and found guilty of robbing a guy and shipped off to prison. Paroled in 1916, he was indicted after a gangmate murdered a policeman that June. Fleeing to Los Angeles, he was finally caught in 1918 and returned to Chicago. While imprisoned, he and 3 other men, including the guy who killed the cop back in 1916, escaped on the night of September 12, 1918. With a $500 bounty on his head, McErlane headed west. Around the 1st of October he was picked up in El Paso, Texas as a draft dodger. World War I was still raging at the time. Producing a card that showed he was exempt from service because he was an ex-con, who, by law, were not able to join the armed services, he was let go. From Texas he traveled to Brisbane, Arizona, where he applied for a job at a mine. Not wanting to repeat the trouble he had in Texas, he went to the local draft board and identified himself as a convicted felon paroled from Joliet prison. He received the necessary paperwork to start his job. It took 3 weeks, but local police received word from Illinois that McErlane was a wanted man. They went to the mine and arrested him at the start of his shift. Resigned to his fate, he simply said, "This is a small world after all." McErlane was brought back to Chicago where he stated, "I've been a fool my whole life. I can't understand why I participated in the jailbreak." He was sent to Joliet for the remainder of his sentence. By the time he was released in 1921, Prohibition was the law of the land and he went where the money was. He co-headed a bootlegging gang with his pal Joe Saltis, who served their bailiwick of Chicago's Southside with beer supplied by John Torrio, who also orchestrated the tenuous peace that reigned throughout Chicago's underworld, each gang in their established territory respecting each other's boundaries. For the most part things went smoothly, and then Spike O'Donnell was released from prison. Edward Spike O'Donnell was an underworld character from the South Side, and when he returned to the neighborhood he wasn't going to sit out the riches of Prohibition. Since the city had already been carved up without him, he decided to cut out his own piece of the South Side for him and his gang. Soon his goons were forcing O'Donnell beer on customers of Saltis and McErlane. Not only did this put him at odds with them but also with Torrio. In the early days of what became known as the Chicago Beer Wars, the press stated that the troubles lied with Torrio and the O'Donnells. The first bootlegging murder attributed to McErlane took place on the evening of September 7, 1923, when the O'Donnell brothers and their enforcers, George Spot Booker, George Meehan, and Jerry O'Connor were sitting in a tavern eating and drinking after a hard day of busting the heads of reluctant barkeeps in Southside McErlane territory. As the hoodlums were downing their beer and sandwiches, a contingent of Southside McErlane men came in headed by Danny McFall, who, on the books, was a deputy sheriff, but served the Southside McErlane gang. He fired a couple of shots and the O'Donnell party ran out the side and back doors. All but O'Connor, who didn't make it out. At this point McErlane stepped inside with a sawed-off shotgun under his coat. McFall said something to him and he went back outside. O'Connor was then forced to exit the door McErlane had just used. Gunfire erupted. Books tell us that McErlane blew off O'Connor's head. Contemporary news accounts state that he was killed by a single shot through the chest. Less than 2 weeks later, on September 17, O'Donnell enforcers George Meehan and Spot Booker, who managed to escape when O'Connor got it, were cruising along in Meehan's roadster when a sedan drew up alongside them. As it pulled up, a man believed to be Danny McFall opened fire with a pistol from the front passenger seat, while a man in the back, assumedly McErlane, opened fire with a shotgun. The duo poured fire into the roadster as they pulled up alongside it. Once their weapons were empty, they each grabbed another and continued firing. Both of the O'Donnell gangsters were riddled to the point of being unrecognizable. Interestingly, a witness claimed that the man in the back seat firing the shotgun appeared to be Italian and Al Capone was brought in. He was paraded in front of the O'Donnell gang to see if he was one of those on hand when O'Connor was killed. All the gangsters refused to identify him. The following December 1, 2 of Spike O'Donnell's beer trucks left the brewery at Joliet and started the drive back to Chicago. One of the trucks was driven by Thomas Morris Keene. In the passenger seat sat William Egan. Before long, the trucks were pulled over by 2 sedans filled with armed men. The trucks were stolen and the O'Donnell men split between the 2 sedans. As fate would have it, Keene and Egan ended up in the car with Frank McErlane, who was literally riding shotgun. With hands bound, they were tossed in the back seat. After traveling a while, the driver asked McErlane what he was going to do with the prisoners. A few minutes later, he leaned over the front seat and fired into Keene twice. "I guess you might as well get yours too," he said to Egan before letting him have it. A second shot was fired into his leg. McErlane reloaded and tore away a chunk of Egan's face with another shot, and the beer runner slipped to the floor. Egan heard McErlane fire another shot into Keene before turning the gun and firing a fourth and final shot into him. Clambering into the back seat, McErlane opened the door and kicked Keene out. Next, he grabbed Egan and tossed him out onto the road. Egan rolled for a while before coming to a stop in a puddle and passing out. Miraculously, Egan survived and, as dawn broke, was able to find his way to help. This episode would be inaccurately labeled Gangland's first one-way ride, and as a result of Egan's living to tell the tale, Frank McErlane would be declared the originator of this method of execution. The following spring, another murder would be added to McErlane's canon of slaughter. This one more sadistic, more atrocious than the Gangland murders because the victim was an innocent man. His only crime, drinking in the same tavern as McErlane. However, what happened and what is repeated are 2 different things. First, the myth. Frank McErlane sits at the bar in a tavern on the outskirts of Crown Point, Indiana with a couple of Confederates. He is drunk, and to prove to his companions what a great shot he is, he draws his .45 and shoots a patron through the head. This is the story told in books and no doubt embellished over the years. The real story, or as real as can be ascertained through contemporary witnesses, is that on May 4, 1924, McErlane and a group of 4 or 5 other men and a woman stopped in at the Halfway House Tavern near Crown Point. They were already drunk from a previous stop and pulled in with the objective of robbing the place. The group entered with guns drawn and commenced in an orgy of violence for approximately 30 minutes. The staff and patrons were all pistol-whipped and beaten as the inebriated hoodlums robbed them of cash and valuables. One of the customers was a lawyer named Thaddeus Fancher who talked back to the marauders and was treated extra harshly. His companion, Frank Cochran, tried to get him to quiet down. At some point one of the gunmen bashed Fancher over the head with his pistol and, as the lawyer was falling, another shot him in the chest. The hoodlums then lit the place on fire, with the victims still inside, and fled. While speeding away, the bandits crashed their car. McErlane and a few others escaped while two men, John O'Reilly and Alec McCabe, and the woman were captured. O'Reilly went on trial first and was sentenced to life in prison. After 2 trials McCabe was found guilty, but his attorneys were able to get a third trial. As the date of the trial approached, witness Frank McErlane, who was the companion of the victim Thaddeus Fancher, was found dead in Crown Point. Somebody had sunk an axe into his head. The third time was the charm and McCabe was acquitted. Indiana authorities wanted McErlane for the murder of McErlane and for the murder of Fancher. The sheriff of Crown Point unsuccessfully tried to have the gangster extradited to Indiana. His failure was credited to McErlane's strong political associations. With the Fancher case in the rearview mirror, McErlane moved on with business. 1925 was a volatile year for gangland Chicago. In addition to other gangs duking it out around the city, the Saltus McErlane gang went to war with the neighboring Ralph Sheldon gang. This gave ideas to Spike O'Donnell, who had been pretty quiet since the murders of late 1923. Arming for war, McErlane purchased a Thompson machine gun, supposedly the first gangster to do so. The underworld and pop culture would never be the same. Just as McErlane has the distinction of being the first gangster to own a Thompson, the honor of being the first target of said Tommy gun goes to his arch-nemesis, Spike O'Donnell. On September 25, 1925, as O'Donnell and a police officer stood chatting in front of a store, a sedan pulled up. "Hello Spike," an occupant of the car said. O'Donnell looked just in time to see a gun barrel. He hit the deck as McErlane sprayed the store front with a blast from his new toy. As the car pulled away, Spike got up and dusted himself off. Less than 2 weeks later on October 4, McErlane unleashed his Thompson again, spraying the front of a club belonging to the Sheldon gang. One man was killed, another wounded. The bullets flew both ways, and around the beginning of November, Joe Saltus was wounded. Over the next 6 months, McErlane would be a person of interest in a number of murders, including those of 2 men who were found in the back seat of a car a few days before Christmas. On February 9, 1926, another machine gun attack took place at a saloon, wounding 2 Sheldon gangsters. A few months later, 2 of Sheldon's affiliates, Frank De Laurentiis and John Tuxello, were encroaching on McErlane Saltus territory. They were kidnapped while making a delivery and executed. Their bodies were found in a car parked in front of Ralph Sheldon's house. About a week later, on April 22, 1926, McErlane was arrested for violation of the Prohibition Act for selling alcohol in Indiana. Since he would be heading to the Hoosier State on a bootlegging charge, the sheriff from Crown Point saw this as an opportunity to prosecute him for the Fancher murder. As he was leaving the jail after posting bail, a warrant for the murder of the Indiana lawyer was delivered to him and he was immediately rearrested. He sat in jail while his lawyers fought extradition. He didn't wither away in a cell, on the contrary, through bribes, he had the run of the place. This included unlimited amounts of liquor being brought in. At one point he showed up for a court appearance half in the bag. The bailiffs were the first to suspect that he was drunk when he insisted on hugging them before they escorted him into the courtroom. He became belligerent throughout the proceedings. His guard was also found to be intoxicated. An investigation uncovered examples of McErlane getting drunk and attacking other prisoners and guards. One prison employee was asked how often he'd seen McErlane drunk. "So many times I couldn't count them," he replied. It came out that McErlane was buying privileges from the guards with a seemingly never-ending supply of $10 bills. One guard who refused the bribe disclosed that McErlane asked him if he smoked. When he said yes, the gangster pulled out a 10 spot and said, "Buy yourself a few cigars." When he declined, McErlane said, "Don't be a damn fool, they are all taking it, so why not you?" By August the party was over and he was sent to Indiana to await his trial. All in all, McErlane spent almost a year in prison before being acquitted on March 3, 1927 for the murder of Thaddeus Fancher. He immediately returned to Chicago where, in addition to his family, he was greeted by his fellow gangmates Joe Saltis and John Dingbat Oberta for a celebration. McErlane returned to business and for the most part was able to stay out of trouble. On May 12, 1929, he was driving drunk and rear-ended another car. When the driver of the other car got out, McErlane attacked him with a .45. The guy ran and called the cops. When they arrived, McErlane was mumbling to himself while trying to change a tire. The .45 was in his pocket and 2 Lugers were found in the car. He was brought to the precinct where he promptly passed out. When he woke, he didn't remember the accident. He beat the rap on both the reckless driving and gun possession. He got in trouble again the following month. On June 15, he was once again driving while drunk with some Confederates and speeding. A motorcycle cop gave chase and he slammed on the brakes, causing the cop to crash into the rear of his car. The gangsters smacked him across the head with a gun and stole his badge. They continued their joyride by firing off rounds into the night. Later they entered a saloon and, after slamming their guns on the bar, demanded that the beers were on the house. He ordered the patrons to drink fast and the bartender had to keep refilling their glasses as fast as they could empty them. After about an hour, he fired some shots into the floor. An officer arrived with a shotgun and took back the motorcycle cop's badge and let the gangsters go. They went to another roadhouse where they reportedly forced the customers to dance at gunpoint. As the 20s came to an end, trouble was brewing within the Saltis-McErlane gang. By this time Joe Saltis was semi-retired and living on a farm in Wisconsin, and there was a falling out between McErlane and Dingbat Oberta. Perhaps it was due in part to the former's excessive drinking. Another theory is that McErlane had thrown in with one-time arch-nemesis Spike O'Donnell. On January 28, 1930, McErlane checked himself into a hospital with a bullet wound in his leg. Although he claimed that he accidentally shot himself, it is believed that he was shot by his girlfriend Elfrida Rigas during a drunk row. About a month later, on February 24, Dingbat Oberta and his chief aide, Sam Malaga, entered McErlane's hospital room and opened fire. Prepared for just such an invasion, the gangster pulled a pistol from under his pillow and returned the shots. Despite being hit 3 times, he managed to drive the invaders from the room. McErlane remained mum about the shooting except to say that police should look for the gunman in a ditch soon. Less than 2 weeks later, Oberta and Malaga were found dead. Later that spring, McErlane and his girlfriend Elfrida checked into a hotel. On May 2, they got drunk and began fighting. Furniture and windows were broken. Police arrived and found the couple in their pajamas yelling at each other. They were brought in for disorderly conduct but released the next day. According to Elfrida's mother, they drove to St. Louis and were married on May 7. Over the course of the year, McErlane's name was regularly in the papers, generally when listed with other gangsters. However, a possible attempt on his life earned him his own headlines again. On May 26, 1931, he reportedly returned from a trip to New York and supposedly went to his sister's place. Later that night there was a machine gun attack on the house and he slipped out the back door. His brother-in-law, however, stated that he was never there and that there wasn't a machine gun attack. He said friends inside the house had fired off some guns. Whether or not the machine gun attack happened, McErlane's paranoia coupled with alcohol abuse was getting the better of him. It was a week later that he was picked up for firing his shotguns at imaginary gunmen in the rain. While he was locked up, his sister reported that he attacked her. She said that he knocked her down and also bit her face. While at the show up the next day, he tried attacking photographers. Authorities felt that the constant fear of being on the spot was taking a mental toll and wanted to send him to a psychiatric hospital. The summer was spent on a houseboat that he purchased and kept on the Illinois River in Beardstown, Illinois. Once autumn came, he and Elfrida returned to Chicago. And the drinking continued. October 7, 1931 found the McErlanes home and drinking. A fight broke out. What it was over is unknown, but the result was that Elfrida was found dead in the back of McErlane's sedan along with her 2 dogs, which had also been shot. The car was parked at around 10:30 that evening and McErlane was identified as a customer at a nearby drugstore, downing 4 cups of coffee before disappearing. The waitress said that he was noticeably drunk. Police went to McErlane's house and discovered evidence of drinking and his arsenal but no Frank. They also learned about his houseboat and checked there but only found a fridge full of booze. After 2 months, McErlane's lawyer contacted the Chicago authorities and told them that his client would surrender to them at a hotel in Madison, Wisconsin. The time was set for 1:30 p.m. The gangster arrived at 6 and blamed his tardiness on a snowstorm. It was determined that he had been hiding out at Joe Saltus's Wisconsin farm. Despite the fact that his wife and her dogs were found in the back seat of his car, on December 30th, authorities were forced to let McErlane go for lack of evidence. After skating on his wife's murder, McErlane moved, or was enticed to move by fellow gang members, to his houseboat in Beardstown, where he couldn't get into trouble. He lived there with his mother and a handful of guys who came and went. Towards the end of September 1932, he became ill. He continued to decline, so was brought to the hospital in Beardstown on October 4th, where he was diagnosed with double pneumonia. After a few days, delirium set in. For attendants had to hold him down, as the ghost he fired at that night in the rainstorm came back. At one point, as the end neared, he got out of bed and knocked a nurse unconscious. Finally, at 6 a.m. on October 8, 1932, the 1-year anniversary of his wife's murder hitting the papers, his pneumonia did what rival gangsters and the law failed to do: put Frank McErlane on the spot. Though useless against the foe that finally got him, while removing him from his room, his trusty pistols were found under his pillow. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and consider subscribing. If you would like to read more about Prohibition-era gangsters, please check out my books available through Amazon. Links and details are in the description. Thank you.